Hey guys, it's ETA Prime back here again. Today I'm going to be putting together an $830 gaming PC / emulation PC. Now with this build here, you're going to see a few parts that aren't totally necessary and you can swap them out for other parts or not even use them at all and get the price down a bit cheaper. And I will leave an alternate build log in the description if you're really interested in it. This rig's going to be powered by the Ryzen 5 3600 and a 5500 XT. I do want to give a big shout out to ASRock for sending this over. I completely understand that this isn't a top-of-the-line card, but it should get us by with some decent 1080p gaming. Now, when I'm doing a build for myself, I usually don't like flash. I like to keep it as minimalistic as possible. But for this one here, I am going to add some lighted fans. Actually RGB, but most of the time they're going to be set to red because I think it's going to make the whole system pop with the case I chose here. This is my black and red build. So like I mentioned, for the CPU, we're going to be using the Ryzen 5 3600, 6 cores, 12 threads, base clock of 3.6 GHz with a boost of 4.2. I recently used the same CPU in a small form factor build and I absolutely love it for emulation and 1080p gaming. It works great. It's one of my favorite CPUs right now and it's going for $174 as of making this video. Of course, you can get a much cheaper part like the 1600 AF or the 2600 if you wanted to. The 3600 does come pre-packaged with a Wraith Stealth cooler, but I'm not going to be using it for this build. I'm actually going to be using a Wraith Spire that I never used on a 2700 build I did a few months ago. So X570 motherboards are pretty expensive right now, and X470s are coming down. You can actually find them refurbished for pretty cheap. So I chose the X470 Aorus Ultra Gaming. I've built with 2 of these in the past and I never had any issues at all. But these will work with the 3rd gen Ryzens as long as that BIOS is up to date, and I've updated this with an older chip, so it should be good to go. Like I mentioned, ASRock was kind enough to send over one of their Phantom Gaming 5500 XTs, and this is the 8GB model. I personally haven't tested the 5500 XT, but I do have a 5700 in one of my other builds, and it does a great job. So I really have to see how this performs before I can recommend it, but these are going for around $189 to $199. I've been using this Team Force RAM in a lot of my builds because it's pretty inexpensive and it works great. This is 16 gigabytes of DDR4 at 3200 megahertz, and I made sure I chose the red version because, like I mentioned, this is my black and red build. As for storage, I'm using a 960 gigabyte 2.5 inch Kingston SSD, and I never do this with any of my builds, but I figured I'd go ahead and splurge a little bit, and it really wasn't splurging because all 5 of these fans were only $25. These are up here RGB fans, and unfortunately these can't be controlled from within software, but it does come with its own controller and infrared remote. We'll have to really see how these look. Power supply is an EVGA 550B3. I bought this refurbished. It's fully modular. I'm a big fan of these modular power supplies. This is actually the 4th one of these that I've bought. It is one of the best power supplies that I've ever used, and that's why I keep going back to it. And finally, the case. This is a Phanteks P300 in black and red. I've used the white one in the past. They also make another black one, but I love the way these cases are set up. Build quality is great. Awesome cable management. You have plenty of room for drives in the front here. 2 3.5 inch drives can fit here, and 2 2.5 inch drives in the back. Tons of room in here for water cooling and oversized GPUs. It's got a power supply basement, but the best part about these cases, they're only $59.99. So I'm going to get right down to it. I'm excited to see how this thing turns out. I want to see how it performs and how it looks. Now the way I set this up, I can always upgrade that GPU down the road, but for now we're using that 5500 XT, but I'm pretty sure we'll get some great 1080p PC gaming performance out of this and 4K emulation. I've opted not to use the Wraith Stealth cooler that comes included with the 3600, but it will get you by. The Wraith Spire is something that I already had in stock. It's just laying on the shelf. It's got a little more meat to it, and it does have that LED ring around it, so I think it'll set this whole thing off. So when I'm doing any kind of PC build for myself or other people, one of my rules of thumb is not spend over $60 on a case, and that's exactly what we get here with the P300. If you're thinking about building a PC, no matter what kind of parts you're putting in it, definitely have a look at this Phanteks P300. I'm not sponsored by them at all. This is the 2nd time I've used this case, and I really do like it. If we take a look at the back here, we have plenty of room to route all of our cables. I can even throw in this little RGB fan controller and have more room than I need back here. So the whole thing's going together very nicely. I just need to do some cable management and install the GPU. Once I get everything cleaned up, we'll take a look at how this thing looks with all of this RGB. Now, like I said, I'm not a big fan of it, but I think it might go over pretty good with a build like this. So I've got everything together, all my cables are tidied up. I think it goes together quite well. I wish that RAM was the same color as the interior of the case, but I can get over it. This is actually the first time I've ever used any RGB fan, so I'm really interested on how it's going to look when everything's powered on. And overall, I think it turned out pretty good. Now I do have these fans set to red and I have some RGB on the motherboard and the GPU that needs to be changed in software. But for what it is, I actually think it turned out pretty nicely. I wasn't sure if I was going to like it or not, but when everything's set to red, I think it looks great. But for anybody who wants to change it up a bit, it does come with a remote for these RGB fans and you can change them any color you'd like. You can have the pulsing rainbow, there's tons of different settings in here. But for me, I'm probably just going to keep it red. Now it doesn't look bad when it's set to white either. So the total cost on this whole setup, $835 USD. Now like I mentioned, there are a few parts here that you could opt out of. So if we took away that extra CPU cooler, because the 3600 does come with a cooler, those extra fans, knock the RAM down to 8 gigs and swapped out that 3600 for let's say the 2600, you could bring the price down to around $700. And you could even get it down lower than this by going with a different motherboard and different storage options. But this is what I have here, and now it's time to see how this rig performs. Alright, so it's up and running. Temps on everything look pretty great. We have that Ryzen 5 3600, 6 cores, 12 threads, 3.6 GHz base clock, 4.2 boost, 16 GB of DDR4 at 3200 MHz, and the Radeon RX 5500 XT with 8 gigs of VRAM. Now I've already run some benchmarks, I don't want to go over those before we get into some gameplay. First up, Geekbench 5, single core 1187, multi 5833. Not too bad, not too shabby. I need to go back and test a lot of my other stuff with Geekbench 5 because I've been using Geekbench 4 for so long, so I really have nothing to compare this to. As for some GPU benchmarks, I just ran a quick 3D Mark Time Spy. Overall score 5,248, graphics score 5,074, CPU score 6,520. Now recently, I built another machine with this same CPU, but using an NVIDIA GeForce GTX 1650. Overall score for that 3,692. Graphics score 3,434, CPU score 6,448. Now this was a small form factor build, I'll leave a link to it in the description, but we were better than 18% of all other results. With this build, it's stating that we're better than 36% of all other results, and we did get a significant increase in performance on that GPU. I wasn't expecting it to trump that 1650 as much as it did, but it looks like it's doing pretty good. And finally, I ran Cinebench R20. Overall score 3,083, beating out the older Xeon 5650 and the i7 7700K by quite a bit here, 3,083. Not bad at all. But I built this for gaming, so let's go ahead and get right into it. So I will be showcasing some gameplay for a few games, but with a lot of the other ones I just ran the built-in benchmarks. This is Overwatch. We're getting an average of 197 FPS here. Ultra settings, 1080p, with the scaling resolution of 120%. Performance here with this one is stellar, but this is an older title and it runs great on a lot of lower end systems. Next up, we have Dauntless, 1080p, ultra settings, 100% scaling. We're getting an average of 113 FPS here. And it's much higher when we're not in these battle scenes, so that's really why I wanted to capture it right here. GTA 5 1080p, I got a mix going on here, high and very high settings, an average of 117 to 118 FPS in the city with a lot of stuff going on, but this game will jump up to around 145 FPS when you're not in the city and there's not a lot of cars and pedestrians around. So GTA 5 is perfectly playable on a machine like this. As I stated, with a few games I just ran the built-in benchmark, and Far Cry 5 really surprised me. 1080p, ultra settings, given I don't have the HD texture pack turned on, but we're getting an average of 84 FPS, a minimum of 75, and a maximum of 99. 1080p ultra settings on this 5500 XT. This little thing's turning out to be a decent little GPU in my opinion. Assassin's Creed Odyssey has always been one of those harder to run games. 1080p, I'm at the high preset, average 64, minimum 31, maximum of 119. I also tested this on ultra high and we only got an average of around 47. So it's not the greatest, and I would recommend going with some high medium settings with a game like this. Forza Horizon 4, 1080p, ultra settings. I was pretty impressed by this also from this little GPU, and it does have a lot to do with this 3600, but we got 98 FPS in the benchmark, ultra preset, 1080p. Very nice performance. And finally, at least for the on-screen gameplay, we have Red Dead Redemption 2. 1080p with a mix of medium, high, and ultra settings. This is just one of those games you have to go through and change a bunch of settings to get it to run properly on your system. I am using the Vulkan backend with this one, and surprisingly enough, we got an average of 70 FPS, a minimum of 24, and a maximum of 100. So yes, a system like this, with some tweaks, will run Red Dead 2 at a pretty decent frame rate. So everything you just saw was running at 1080p, but I did want to step it up a bit, so I tested at 1080p high, 1080p ultra, 440p high, 440p ultra, and just 4K high, because I was sure that some of these games would perform well at 440p high on this system. So I went through and tested 6 more games. So in the end, I'm pretty impressed with the 1080p gaming performance of this PC. Now, I do want to do a lot of emulation testing with this, but the video's already drawn out long enough, so I will have a dedicated emulation video coming up very shortly. So stay tuned to the channel for that. We'll be testing out some Wii U, some PS3, some 3DS, PS2, and all the great emulators. I got a good feeling that this system, just like it sits, will perform pretty well in most of those areas. I gotta say, I was expecting a little less from that 5500 XT, but it performed pretty well at 1080p. Now, if you just threw $30 more at this machine, you could upgrade to the 1660 Super, which will blow the 1550 XT out of the water. Not by much, but it is a jump, and I'd say it is worth that $30 price increase for the 1660 Super over the 5500 XT. But I wanted to do an all AMD Black and Red build, and I think it turned out pretty decently from the parts I used. So that's pretty much it for this video, guys. I really appreciate you watching. If you're interested in putting something like this together, I will leave links in the description. I'll also leave links for a cheaper alternative build that should net you some pretty decent performance at 1080p. Definitely keep an eye on the channel because I will have a full emulation video on this setup coming up very shortly. But like always, thanks for watching.